Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel. I'm Rebecca Keppel. If you've seen some of my other videos before, you know how much I love Distress Oxide inks. In today's video, I'm going to tell you why. I've gotten lots of questions about Distress Oxides, whether or not you absolutely need them, if you already have Distress inks, what's the difference between the two, why do I love them so much, and on and on. And I wanted to answer those questions today. So in today's video, I'm going to share 8 different reasons why I love Distress Oxides and think they are well worth the investment. Along the way, I'm going to share some tips and tricks for using the Distress Oxide inks, and I have about 6 different card samples that I'm not going to show you start to finish how I created them, but I am going to give you an idea on how to use Distress Oxides in your card making. So let's jump right into reason number 1 that I love Distress Oxides. My favorite thing about Distress Oxide ink is how easily it blends. Of course, you can blend with lots of different kinds of inks. Honestly, when I started as a card maker, I really struggled to get a smooth, even blend, even when I was using regular Distress inks. The first time I tried a few colors of Distress Oxide inks with ink blending, I was blown away. So if you have any trouble at all with ink blending, getting a smooth blend, not having harsh lines in your blending, I would definitely recommend trying out blending with Distress Oxide inks. First, let's take a look at the difference between a Distress ink and a Distress Oxide of the same color. Here's the new Speckled Egg. You can see the Distress ink pad is a typical felt pad and it's saturated with what looks like a dark color. When I press my finger on the pad, you can barely see the color because it's already sinking into my skin. What I love about the Distress Oxide is that the color looks true on the pad itself and sits on top of my finger. Basically, Distress inks are dye inks and sink in and act more like a wood stain, whereas oxides have some elements of pigment ink and sit on top of the paper, and to continue the wood metaphor, they act more like paint than a stain. I'm going to start off using original Distress inks for a 3-color blend. I'm using Tumbled Glass, Speckled Egg, and Faded Jeans. I'm working on a smooth Bristol paper to ensure the smoothest blend, and I'm using a foam blender, which is also generally an easy way to get a nice smooth blend. But you can see that I'm struggling, especially with the darker colors, to get nice even coverage with no lines. And I don't really succeed even after going back over the colors multiple times and trying to blend them out. Here are the 2 blending foams. The Tumbled Glass Distress ink is on the left and the Tumbled Glass Oxide was on the right. Even on the foam, you can notice there's a nice even true coverage on the Distress Oxide tool. Now I'm going to do the same tricolor blend, and you can see right away that I'm having a much easier time achieving that smooth blend without harsh lines. Here are both panels, the Distress ink on the left and the Distress Oxide on the right, and you can see that I had a much easier time getting that smooth blend with the Distress Oxide ink with a lot less work. You can even get great results using different colors that may traditionally be harder to blend out. I'm using Worn Lipstick, Abandoned Coral, and then Squeezed Lemonade, and I'm able to get easy, quick, smooth results with the oxides. So definitely, if you have trouble blending or think that you're not good at blending, I would recommend to try the oxides. Let's complete a card with the blended panel of blue oxides. I'm going to use Dina Wakley's Media Gloss Spray in White for a few white splatters. Next, I'm going to adhere the panel to an A2 navy cardstock and add stamped, colored, and die-cut images from the Waffle Flowers Under the Sea combo. The Distress Oxide blended background makes a perfect under the sea background for my little critters. If you've used a water-reactive ink before, like Distress inks, then you know how much fun it is to do techniques where you splatter water on them. Well, Distress Oxides have a totally different look to them. They're also water-reactive, meaning that you can get them to move around by putting water on them. But the look that you get when you splatter water on Distress Oxides is so unique and so fun. To do this technique, I have my Distress sprayer filled with water, and I spritz both the Distress ink panel and the Distress Oxide blended panel, and then lay a dry towel on top. and I just pat that dry to dry the water droplets. You can see that both react to the water, but the Distress ink simply moves the color away from the droplet so that the outline of the droplet is a dark color, whereas the Distress Oxide is so unique and creates a white halo. Here, the Distress ink panel is again on the left, and the Distress Oxide panel is on the right. These are ink smooshing panels, and you can see the real difference between the dried droplets on these two panels. So I dry them with a dry towel once again, and you can see that the right side has that oxidation effect, kind of turns the droplet white or creates that white halo, whereas the left creates a just movement of the color away from the center. They're both beautiful, but the oxides are a truly unique effect that you can't get with any other ink. If you've been using Distress inks for a while, you know they are more of a technique ink than a stamping ink. And Distress Oxides are great for lots of different techniques as well, which we're going to cover a bunch of them in this video, but they actually stamp beautifully, not just on solid images, but on fine detail sentiments as well. First, let's take a look at stamping sentiments with oxides. I'm using the Just Keep Swimming sentiment from the Waffle Flower Under the Sea sentiment stamp set. Anytime I want a great result, I use my Misty and I stamp multiple times, but you can see how beautifully the Distress ink stamps crisp and clear. Now, to stamp the same sentiment with the same color of the regular Distress ink this time. The edges just don't have that crispness to them that the oxide has. Plus, since the oxides can be layered on top of each other, I can even stamp the sentiment on top of the ink blended panel. The Distress ink does not layer as well, and you can see some of the panel coming through the sentiment there. Now let's show the difference in stamping solid images. First, these leaf images are stamped with Twisted Citron and Lucky Clover regular Distress ink, and they do have a pretty almost watercolor look to them. But when I do the same technique with Distress Oxides, you get a beautiful, clean, blended result with crisp outlines. I'm going to continue to use different distress colors of Distress Oxides to stamp more of the Waffle Flower XOXO stamp set. And you can see that using the Misty, stamping multiple times, and using the oxides achieves really beautiful results. If you've been paper crafting for a while, you may remember back in the day, we used to ink all the edges of everything to make things stand out and pop. Well, I remember using chalk inks to do that, and it took forever and a year for those things to dry. So I love using that same technique of inking edges with Distress Oxides because the dry time is way less. Using the tricolor blended panel that we created earlier, I'm going to grab a slightly darker oxide Festive Berries and use the foam blender to ink around the edges to make them stand out and then tie all that blending together. I also love the look of ink blending on white cardstock, or for darker colors, a nice dark brown inked edge would look great too. Let's complete this card with both of the inked edge panels. I've scattered some thank you stamps on the panel, and I'm going to ink them up with Candied Apple Distress Oxide ink. These stamps are from the Waffle Flower Classic Sentiment stamp set. I'll move the stamps around and then stamp them in Festive Berries, and then I'll do the same thing with Abandoned Coral, and then I'll finally move on and do the same thing with Fossilized Amber. I love how you can see all the different colors even on top of the ink blended panel. I'll layer both inked edges on top of each other and add our Distress Oxide stamped images with tape runner and foam squares. This card combines Distress Oxide blending, inked edges, stamped images, and stamped sentiments. This ink is really a very great multi-purpose ink. To finish the card off, I'm going to use a few Waffle Flower Clean and Clear enamel dots as embellishments. Because the Distress Oxides actually sit on top of the paper rather than sink fully in, they are great for stamping on colored cardstock. I love the look of Distress Oxides stamped on craft because you don't get that muddy look of dye inks which sink in and take on the color of the craft. I'm going to share how Distress inks on the left and Distress Oxides on the right stamp on craft colored cardstock. This is the same color, worn lipstick, in both formulations, and you can see how much darker the Distress ink looks. That's because the Distress inks are sinking into the craft, and so the color appears as a mix of the ink color and the brown of the craft. Let's complete this card with Distress Oxide stamped hearts. I'm going to keep this one real simple by adhering the panel to a piece of Gina K Dusty Rose colored cardstock, and I'm going to add a Simon Says Stamp sentiment strip. I needed to trim the edge of the sentiment strip to match the width of the craft cardstock, but a sharp pair of nonstick scissors did the trick even though I had already adhered it down. I finished this card off with a few white enamel dots from Waffle Flower's Clean and Clear set. I love that you can really see the true color of the Distress Oxide inks even when they are stamped on this craft cardstock. If you love to use stamp layering in your card making, you've probably noticed that even if you dry between layers, sometimes dye inks just kind of mush together because they sink into the paper. Well, with Distress Oxides, if you dry in between the layers, you are going to notice that they sit on top of each other, and so the second color really stands out. For the first example, I'm using regular Distress inks in Salty Ocean and Tumbled Glass. I'm stamping a layered flower from the Simon Says Stamp Thank You Flowers stamp set. After stamping the tumbled glass layer of the flower, I heat set it in between, and then I stamp the second layer with Salty Ocean. Again, because these aren't really stamping inks, you don't get a smooth, even coverage. I'm going to do the same colors of Distress Oxide inks, and you can see how beautifully they stamp and how amazing these layers look. Now we will try stamping the darker color first. You can see that worn lipstick in Distress ink looks very different than worn lipstick Distress Oxide ink. Now to try to stamp Spun Sugar, which is a much lighter color on top. The Distress ink is not visible at all, but you can see how even a much lighter color can be layered on top when you're using Distress Oxides. Now let's complete this card with more Distress Oxide stamping. I'm going to use the large thank you sentiment from that Simon Says Stamp set and stamp it with Blueprint Sketch Distress Oxide on an A2 white cardstock panel. I use my MISTI so I can stamp multiple times to get out the best impression. Next, I grab a tiny little sub-sentiment from the set. When straightening it out, I like to use my scissors because the stamp usually sticks to my fingers. I'm using the darker Distress Oxide Chipped Sapphire since the print is so small, I really want it to stand out. I want some small stamped leaves to appear behind my flower, so I place the flower where I want it on the panel, then place the stamped leaves on top, close the door of the MISTI, pick up the stamps, remove the flower, and then ink up the stamps with Twisted Citron Distress Oxide ink. I rotate the panel so I have more room for that third leaf sprig that I want to stamp at the bottom. I trim the panel down and pull out my cardstock swatch book to decide which color of cardstock I want to layer it on top of. I decide on Gina K's Key Lime and use tape runner to adhere them together. I pop up the flower on foam squares and then use the Studio Katia embellishment wand to pick up sequins and Thermoweb Ultra Bond to adhere them down. This card combines Distress Oxide stamping of sentiments, images, and stamp layering. Just like other water-reactive inks, Distress Oxides can be used for the ink smooshing technique. The thing that I love about the results of using Distress Oxides when you're doing this technique is they have a very opaque finish to them. I am working on my Waffle Flower water media mat, and I'm using Waffle Flower's palette paper to protect the mat from staining. And swiping 3 colors of Distress ink onto the palette paper, I then spritz it with water and use my Distress sprayer and swipe watercolor paper through the wet ink. I continue to do this until the paper is covered. Next, we'll do the same thing with the same 3 colors of Distress Oxide inks. Even before swiping the paper, you can see that the Distress Oxides look different, more opaque and paint-like, and less like watercolors. Honestly, I like both of the effects here, but I like how unique the Distress Oxides look when they're dry. Let's use the Distress Oxide panel to complete this card. First, I splatter some Sukaneko Sheer Simmer Spray on the panel. Next, I cut one of the Simon Says Stamp sentiment strips onto a banner on one end by cutting up the middle and then cutting toward the middle from each end, cutting away 2 small triangles. Using tape runner, I adhere the panel onto an A2 black cardstock panel and then adhere the sentiment strip on top. I'm not going to do anything else to this so that the background can really stand out and shine. Similarly to other water-reactive inks, Distress Oxides can be used to watercolor an image. Distress inks can be used to watercolor images as well, but I really love the unique look of Distress Oxides when they dry. They have this really pretty chalky finish to them. I'm going to watercolor the Waffle Flowers Poppy Hawthorn stamp set using Gina K Designs amalgam ink to stamp it on watercolor paper. I smeared some Distress Oxides onto the palette paper and then spritzed it with water, and I'm picking it up with a small brush and using it to watercolor. The Distress Oxides that I'm using for the watercolor are Squeezed Lemonade, Abandoned Coral, Ripe Persimmon, and Carved Pumpkin. While Distress inks watercolor beautifully, just like Distress Oxides, they cannot color on color cardstock. Here I'm using those same colors of Distress ink on craft cardstock. It's still pretty, but as the colors sink into the craft, certain colors, especially the lighter ones, start to look muddy. But when I use those same colors of Distress Oxides on the craft, the colors really pop, and even the yellows stay true to their original color. Let's complete a card with the Distress Oxide watercolored Poppy Hawthorn image. I had to trim down the panel because I got some ink spots on the front, so I decided to layer it on Gina K Dusty Rose cardstock. I added a Simon Says Stamp sentiment strip, and then I use the Studio Katia embellishment wand and Thermoweb Ultra Bond liquid glue to adhere the Lucy's Cards Little Things matte gold sequins as accents. It can be hard to see in camera, that chalky finish of the Distress Oxides, but I love that unique effect that only they can offer. I hope this video was helpful in determining why Distress Oxides are so unique and so much fun to use. If you love Distress Oxides as much as I do, let me know in the comments below, and let me know what techniques are your favorites when using them. If you like this video, please give me a thumbs up. Don't forget, if you haven't already, to subscribe to my YouTube channel down below for lots more card making tips, techniques, and reviews of supplies. Don't forget to hit the bell to be notified every time I have a new video available. As always, I appreciate every second that you spend with me. Please stay safe, stay healthy, and I'll see you again soon. Video available. The bell so you can be notified. Oh my gosh.